begin by welcoming all of you to the final lecture of our fall series of talks in our Asian Materialities series. And I'd like to begin by thanking our co-sponsor for this event, the Tchaikovsky Institute for Archaeology in the Ancient World. The series has also been supported by the Program in Early Cultures and by the Chun Family Fund. Now, our speaker series is intended to accomplish two goals. First, we're aiming to ensure that the materiality and visuality of Asia has a prominent place at, here in the interdisciplinary study of the humanities and social sciences at Brown. And so in defining our scope of inquiry as widely as possible, we're aiming to include both the rarefied domains of painting and calligraphy, but also something that we'll be hearing more about tonight, some of the wider array of material artifacts and traces of visual culture. And we're trying to speak in this broad sense to colleagues across the university. Now, our second aim is to explore the ways in which investigations of East Asian materials may help us expand and refine the conceptual constructs that we use to generate knowledge about art and material culture more generally. In other words, we look to Asia to find new things to think about and new ways to think about everything. Our speaker for tonight, Guo Jue, is assistant professor at Barnard College in New York and is co-chair of the Columbia University Early China Seminar. Her scholarship is really about looking through the material culture of ritual as one of her primary sources and thinking through that about social, religious, and cultural history of early China. She's published on such themes as talismanic religion, the spirit world in early China, and divination. She's completing her first book, which is a fascinating micro-historical account of the life and times of a 4th century B.C.E. minister from the southern Chinese kingdom of Chu, based on the remarkable finds from his tomb at Baoshan. The book is entitled A Life on Display, Reconstructing the Worlds of a Chu Official in Early China. Now, one of the aims for the fall series of the Asian Materialities lecture series was to align it as best we could with courses that were being offered this semester, specifically a course that Professor Halston and I are teaching on the visuality of writing that we're calling the pictured text. Whenever you put together a lecture series or a symposium, it always involves an effort to sculpt and massage the various speakers that you brought to campus into the larger topic of the series. And so it is with immense gratitude at the end of a long and challenging semester that I can say that Guo Jue's talk fits so neatly within the framework of the series and of our course that it requires no sculpting at all. Her talk tonight is entitled Textualized Object and Objectified Text, Exploring the Boundaries Between Writing and Object in Early and Medieval China. Please join me in welcoming Guo Jue.
Thank you, Jeff, for such generous and warm welcome, and thank you all for coming at the end of the semester. I understand how busy you must all are, both as faculty wrapping up the semester and also students probably also preparing for the exams, since this is something like what I have been doing before coming here. And for me, this is a really very nice getaway from that busy life and the busy New York. I had a chance to walk a little bit of the lovely town here, and so thank you very much for coming. And I would like to, so today the topic of my talk is, as I'm showing you here, textualized object and objectified text, exploring the boundaries between writing and object in early and medieval China. I just hope that I didn't promise too much with this title, because I guess my talk is actually going to be extremely focused, actually focusing on one particular object that I'm showing you here, but also in a more complete form here, both the front, the back, and the side of it. And I would like to begin my talk by asking a very simple question, or at least a seemingly simple question. What is this? What is it? And I think I will just give you, just a few seconds to look at this object. So this is one object. I'm showing you the three sides of that. And I think the answer to this question actually largely depends on where you lay your eyes first on it, and what your prior knowledge and present interests are. So for the sake of simplicity, allow me make some blunt generalizations and stereotyping assumptions. So I would say an art historian will most likely be attracted to the central figure on the front side. This stern-faced, mustached man in a plain and long robe with white sleeves, standing solemnly, forearms raised in front of the chest, which was originally carved out in lower relief and crudely drawn in black ink, as you can see from the side view of the tablet. A Chinese archaeologist who has experience excavating early imperial Qin Han official documents, on the other hand, or for that matter, if we actually can travel back in time and bring our early official of that period, just ordinary clerk, and showing him this object, they probably will immediately be drawn to the material, form, and format of this object in light of, sorry, I should have moved. So this would be the close-up of the kind of focus of our historian will be looking at primarily, and sort of the rest of the object may just fade into the background, because what will stand out to their interests. And then this, either the present-day Chinese archaeologists who have experience excavating something like the one on the right side, this kind of wooden tablets, who were official documents. This was from the Eastern Han period. So, or as I kind of hypothesized that very unlikely scenario that we can show this tablet, our object, to an imperial clerk of a scribe, let's put it that way, then they will be immediately drawn this kind of comparison from what they know in their mind. So they would immediately thinking of our object as something similar to the official documents for various purposes for the proper functioning of the bureaucracy that by the time of the early imperial China was already rather large, well-established, and also quite effective because of these utilizing these written documentations and also communications throughout the entire empire. However, a historian who has been trained primarily in textual traditions, even though he or she will undoubtedly see the intriguing central figure and also recognize the formal similarity between this object and official document. He or she would give the extensive writing on it front, side, and back, the outermost attention, and try to decipher these texts epigraphically and historically. So as one reads carefully what are written, someone who is familiar with a certain genre of texts that were popular since the 2nd century throughout the entire imperial China, and even in some remote regions or rural regions in China today, we can still see this genre of texts that has been variously called either as tomb quelling wit, 正木文, or apotropic writing, 解除文. And people who are familiar with these kind of documents and texts will certainly be struck by the similarity between the content we are reading here. So this would be the translation. So this is the what were written on so extensively on this object, both on the front, around that central figure, and also on the back. So this is the front side. As we are seeing here, actually, the two sides have a large overlap in terms of the contents. So if I can just go back a little bit and show you where these texts again, and what I arranged the translation also spatially around that central figure. So what we see are the top section that were around and on the central figure, which self-identified as a pieman. So here we actually, later we will see that it's being a pieman, or as the longer texts at the bottom showing apparently there was a counterpart to the pieman who should have been a cypressman. So here I need to add the note that unfortunately this object was acquired in the market. So the provenance was unknown. And that is, so as fascinating as it is, and it's almost the first one of this kind. So this is definitely not the only one, but the first and the earliest one of this kind that have been found so far. There were several very similar ones, both in terms of the shape and the format, and having a central figure drawn on it, been found in much later tombs of 9th century, 10th century, sometimes 11th century tombs, the Tang Song tombs. So most of our speculation, because that's the best we can do for unprovenanced object like this one, is to infer that most likely that the original contact was probably also from a tomb. And we can support this speculation by reading some of the contents of what were written on this. Clearly, this one was, all the texts involve one deceased person. Here I also highlighted the deceased Wang Xi, and with a styled name as Luo Zi. Basically, that was the same person, referring to the same person. And clearly this also was produced for the occasion of his death. And if we can rely on the later examples, then this one probably was also put into his tomb in his burial. So these are the background that because of the loss of its original context that we can only infer and speculate. But what are written on that are actually quite clear. So we see the first 3 sections on the top were very short kind of imperative commands that commanding if there were so and so kind of calamity should happen. In this case is if for some reason that the deceased will be detained and interrogated, even though it wasn't written here, but what would happen was clearly, because this was the time that the belief in terms of the afterlife of the dead and going through potentially suffering, and also interestingly that they can be involved in even legal cases in the afterlife in the underworld, and the underworld was also believed to have a bureaucracy that is almost comparable to the bureaucracy of the living world. So the kind of content here, the occasions that the pine men and the cypress men were supposed to stand up and protect and take whatever the blame or the calamity that would have fall upon the deceased and also his surviving families, that were their responsibility to take them, as it is very, very clearly shown here in the longer texts, where the format itself clearly resembles almost resembles very much of official documents that the one office in the bureaucracy issue such documents communicating these kind of demands to the other offices in the bureaucracy. And here what we see differently are the 2 offices that supposedly one was, we could say, probably a celestial office that represented by this envoy of the heavenly thearch, which was a major deity that particularly in popular beliefs and practices of the time, and addressing to all of these demands to the underworld bureaucracy. And so the format of that closely resembles official documents. And the backside with even longer text written completely, fully occupies the backside of this object, is, as I said, largely overlap with the longer text on the front side, but having sections that, having a new section, as you see, the second part that I also highlighted in yellow. And that is a section is very interesting. So on the front side, and here repeated to dictate what the pineman and this now missing cypressman's task should be, then they also included a paragraph that to warn the pineman and the cypressman. So if they fail to respond in a timely manner, then what kind of punishment they would receive. So here is actually quite severe. That will be, in fact, they will be beaten with a whip 300 times. When we look at, as I said, this would be the scenario that is a person or a historian in particular who were trained in textual traditions and assume familiar ways, all these backgrounds, information, and knowledge about the Han bureaucracy, about the early imperial bureaucracy, and also in terms of the popular practices that having a close relationship with the early imperial, the early empire and the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic practices, particularly in terms of using written documents and written communications. And that kind of prior knowledge would immediately prompt this historian to associate our object, the text in particular, written on this object, with texts like this. This is the typical so-called tomb that I mentioned, the tomb quarreling weight, or the anthropopaic writing, the 真木文 or 解除文, and later will become a major Taoist ritual genre. And something like this, for instance, and this one we have a clear year written as well. So this is from 147 CE. This was our object based on the date written on it is from 340 CE. So that was about 200 years later, and in terms of the dynastic periods in China, then that was the post-Han, so after the Han Empire collapsed. And what we see in this more typical or standard tomb quarreling weight was, on one hand, we do see the similarity. The languages are extremely formulaic models on the official documents. And the kind of command also coming from the envoy of Thearch, in the envoy of the heavenly Thearch, addressing to various underworld officials. So this is something we didn't see as clearly in our object. Here are all the underworld or the tomb graveyard deities, most of them holding official titles, were listed clearly. But a difference that we can observe here is the part highlighted. I know that I'm putting a lot of text on this, and I apologize for this. I guess what I'm saying here is this scenario of this historian trained in textual traditions. Actually, that was me. So that was kind of modeling myself what I would do. But I'm trying very hard to also later you will see to try to go beyond my own comfort zone and to look at the other aspects as well. So bear with me. Here, the difference where instead of pine man or cypress man, what we see here is they're talking about, together with this document, clearly they were also providing the deceased some substitute, probably what would you say, the lead man, the human made of lead. So of course, later I will show you, we didn't find any humans made of lead in the tomb. This one was actually coming from a tomb that we know the archaeological context. So if I move on, then we have another example. And here, then we see again, even though it lacks of a specific date that we have seen in the two previous examples, because of the other materials, we can actually date this document probably to the end of the 1st century CE and the early 2nd century, around, if it's not so precise, and then it's probably around the 94 CE. This was even earlier. but the similarities nonetheless are clear. So the same kind of envoy, even though here the Chinese character says 天地, which translates as heaven and earth, that either this was an alternative term for the heavenly thearch that we have seen, or it's actually even possible this could have been just a typo, because D and D, the two here, the earth and the other thearch in Chinese were actually pronunciation-wise interchangeable, even in the early archaic Chinese. So they were actually, it's very possible, particularly given that these documents, as we have already seen, that they were quite crudely made. They were not very refined objects. This difference aside, then we see a similar reference to the Latman again. So different from the Cyprus and Paiman, but clearly at this time, this kind of documents, Tum Quaoling Wit, very often would having the Latman mentioned as the substitute, as here, which gave very, I think it was the first one where the Latmen actually were described as extremely capable servants that can do all of these tasks. They are quick and fast and capable of pounding rice and cooking, and they get on chariot and capable of driving, and they can even hold a brush, capable of writing. So all of these abilities are very desirable abilities of underworld servants, and not to mention that they were also supposed to take any blame, any suffering, or accusation that directed against the deceased, and they would also be substituting and taking those for the deceased. So they are really kind of all-encompassing type of servants for a more comfortable underworld afterlife. So in this one, what I want to point out is actually what I highlighted here in red, because this is a new information that we haven't seen. And this points to the kind of material carrier, because I haven't showed you that what kind of material form these two documents I just showed you were. And here it has a clue to it. So it mentions that when the jars arrive, and then it goes on to give these similar comments. So what are these jars? They were like this. So these pottery jars, they are actually quite minute. They are most of them about this size, less than 20 centimeters tall, rather small and probably not functional jars that for actually everyday life, even if it's everyday life in the afterworld. And many of them would contain grains. Sometimes they would have labels outside to say the 5 grains. But sometimes they also contain other things, such as what I show you here. I also wanted to point out the photos are not scaled. So tiny jars and even tinier, these latmans, and they are extremely crudely made. Sometimes they were sort of like casted, so having a slightly like a small dimension, little figurine-like. Sometimes they were, I will show you later, they were simply cutted out of a very thin lead or sometimes tin foil. So what they resemble is really just the shape of a human being. In this one is we're seeing in one of the jars we find two such lead men, which also having supposedly to be, as you can see, probably a male and a female. So a servant, a male servant, and a female servant, even though that the rest of the entire figurines were extremely small and very coarsely made. And the second text I showed you is also, even though it didn't mention that there was a jar, but they were also found in such kind of jars. And here, I apologize for the the black-white, extremely poor quality black and white photos, and this is something, unfortunately, that these two tombs were excavated in the early, like this one in 1957, and the previous one I'll show you, this is actually excavated in 1972, and this was really not necessarily the infancy of Chinese archaeology, but definitely still the beginning. If you are familiar with modern Chinese history, this was also an extremely politically unstable period. So. And technologically, that is not comparable to what we have today. That, for instance, the photograph that I showed you, that the Art Museum of Chinese University of Hong Kong provided me, that is an extremely high resolution photograph. And so since 2000, we would have much better both photographic and also much better written archaeological reports, but these earlier ones were, we just have to take them as it is. And many of these material themselves actually were already, we actually don't know where they are now. So I feel very fortunate when last year when I visited Xi'an in the Xi'an Museum, the Xi'an City Museum, I actually find this jar, one of the jars that has been activated from this tomb back in the 1950s, that one of them is actually on display. So I was able to take this much better photo. Unfortunately, due to the original quality of these jars were not, they were also rather, they are low fired, and because they were meant for burial for the dead, and also after this long years of after they were excavated, and as you see these texts that originally were written in brushwork in red ink. We do have some other examples, a couple examples in now stored in Japan, actually having much vivid and still fresh red color, but this one, it has faded quite a bit. These two examples gave us some of the context that our object liked. So this is one of the reasons I think like I wanted to show you this, to kind of make up that I centered my talk on unprovenanced object. I know this is also quite controversial topic, but I just cannot really, I can't help disregarding this object, and also for the practical reason that this is the earliest and only available object of its kind that closer to the period that I specialize, and thus I feel I can work better with this one than the later ones with more proper documentation of their archaeological context. So Now we come back to this original object that after a long-winded kind of journey going through the various scenarios, hypothetical scenarios that I set up. And also we come back to this question that I asked. So I think this question by now should seem that it's not that simple after all. What is it? Of course, one can still just follow the kind of intuitive interests of the prior knowledge to characterize and identify it in the, I will call, anatomical way, as we did through the disciplinary lens of art history, archaeology, history of religion. And so it can be a pine figurine, a wooden tablet, or a talisman with apoptroic writings on it. And previous scholarship indeed leans toward such disciplinary division of labor, especially between art history and archaeology and philology and history, with the former two focusing on artifacts and material culture, and the latter two on texts and the written. In China, the prominence of the written texts in the long-held tradition of classical studies and historiography and the short history of modern archaeology tells the scholarly work heavily toward the written and the text. And therefore, some of the foundational pillars in traditional China, such as bureaucracy, social organization, and religion, have been characterized as strongly textualized and studied accordingly. So just to give a trivial, but I think telling story, example. So when this object was officially published in the volume of the Chinese University of Hong Kong's recent acquisitions of bamboo and wooden manuscripts. So it was included in the volume that publishing all the recent acquired manuscripts written on bamboo and wood, which was the primary written writing material before paper in China. It is identified and labeled as a wooden tablet by the editor under the title Jin Dynasty, or if we use the actual year 340 CE, Pine Man apotropic wooden tablet, Jin Dai Songren Jiechu Mudu. So such anatomical characterization are certainly not wrong per se, but they do not do justice to the richness and complexity of an object, of such an object offers. So as we go through each of these aspects, as we just did, separately, of course, the material, here we are looking at the wood, which was the tablet made of, and ink, the black ink, and even pigments, because unfortunately I haven't had the chance to examine this object myself, but according to the editor, except the area where this Pineman figure occupies, the rest of the tablet, front and back, originally were fully painted in red pigments. Of course, now it seems that it has long faded, but clearly there were still traces left enough for the editor to make this statement. So, and we also can also look at the physical form and its shape and the size. And here that we related in our this anatomical analysis related to those that so far we've unearthed tens of thousands of official documents from the early empire that look like the one I showed you. And we can also look at, of course, this intriguing image, or if you will, this almost three-dimensional figurine of self-identified as a pine and then reaffirmed by the texts written around it. We can also go to the other side that I listed here, the writing, of course, and the texts. So I differentiated between writing and texts. Writing is more referring to just the form of this type of writing, but if we actually think they form a kind of a meaningful unit as these kind of tomb equivalent weight, that we can properly label it as texts. And the context of production, usage, function, as well as something that we do not have for this particular object, even though we do have a little bit of information of that through the writing, the user, the patrons, and the practitioners of this particular object supposed to serve. That we, and some of these, such the precise, I already said this, that because of its unknown provenance and this kind of function that we can only infer partially through the inscribed writing, and especially we had to rely on comparative examples that I've shown to you, that which have clear and known contexts. For instance, that they actually came from tombs. So to address these issues, many have called for nuanced and sophisticated interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches, and attempts made at finding a unifying theory that transcends the boundaries between the objective and subjective, the materialistic and idealistic, that are key to the distinction and relation between text writing and, on one hand, an object image, as well as the kind of disciplinary boundaries that we have already mentioned. For instance, Jonathan Hall, a classical archaeologist who is also known as an archaeohistorian, notes in his work, Artifact and Artifacts, Classical Archaeology and Ancient Historian, says, I quote, both artifact and artifacts share the same Latin etymological derivation and simply mean an object or product, a product created by art or skill. And he further suggests that the juxtaposition of terms such as artifacts and artifacts, or for that matter, archaeology and history, is to, I quote, signal that both material objects and written texts are created artfully by knowledgeable agents, and that both need to be interpreted with art and skill, end quote. Efforts on finding such kind of unifying theoretical lens can also be seen in Alfred Gale's usage of agency in his proposal of anthropological term in the study of art and material culture. In that book, I think many of you are familiar with Art and Agency. Or in Martin Seale's philosophical theorization of aesthetic objects and appearing. As he writes, I quote, aesthetic objects are objects of appearing, the basic distinction to which the aesthetics of appearing owns its name points to a difference between what he calls the sensuous being so and aesthetic appearing. Both are ways in which the empirical appearance of an object accessible. Aesthetic appearing is thus a mode of sensuous givenness of something. Aesthetic are those objects in their appearance stand out more or less radically from their conceptually determinable exterior image, sound, or feel, end quote. So what I find especially inspiring is actually David Van Gogh. He's an archaeologist of Near Eastern studies. He's this module-based approach to study what he calls composite, hybrid objects of image, objects or image, especially those of anthropomorphic nature. He argues that the production and transmission of such composite can be understood through two different notions of modularity. I quote, one rooted in cognition and the other in technology. And this was his main effort he made in his recent published book, 2014, The Origins of Monsters, Image, and Cognition in the First Age of Mechanical Reproduction. This leads me to see our object, this object that I centered my talk on, as such a composite hybrid. But this is not just to circumvent the difficulties that we have outlined. I see the composite hybrid approach as opening up the possibility to more fruitfully interrogate the potential of such objects. Like all of these aspects I listed here. So given the time left, I think I will just limit to, maybe I would only just mention this, and maybe I do have the material prepared, but I think I will, maybe I will just point it to this direction, and if you have questions about it, I can elaborate it in the question and answer section. I think one possible direction of investigation, if we see such objects, and this is really representing a category of object, it's just this one is probably the most illustrative one of the points that I'm trying to make, is the transformation and the transmission of ritual knowledge and technology throughout time. Or in other words, that the question I wanted to ask through seeing this object as a composite or hybrid is to ask what made this object possible at this time. So let me stop here. I know this doesn't really sound like having a conclusion, but this direction is the thing, is what I would like to further study and research through seeing the different components of that. For instance, the materiality of the object, the physical form, the physicality of the object, then of course the image, or you could say iconography or iconology if we use Metro's terminology, and of course writing and texts and various writing as a technology, and then texts of specific nature, in this case of ritualistic nature, or exorcistic nature, and also the contexts, the agents involved that we don't directly see on the object itself, but have to restore it into both its own original context, practical context, but historical context as well. So these are the potential that I see the anatomical approach to such kind of objects would not necessarily lead to. On the other hand, this composite and hybrid approach may lead to, I don't know if it's necessarily would accomplish all of the goals that I listed here, but I think it certainly points to that direction that can lead to more fruitful results. So thank you, and I welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
So thank you very much for an extraordinarily rich contextualization of an object that is extraordinary on a whole range of levels. We have a few minutes for Q&A. Please, if you have any questions at all, this is your opportunity.
Yes, please.
Sure,
go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. I think you said that the writing was repeated on the front and back.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, I'm wondering if that was potentially for different people, or who was the audience of the text? And also, I'm wondering, can you imagine if there's any religious tradition which this belongs to? Like celestial master. I mean, I'm interested in Taoism, so celestial masters or something else. And I had another question, but I can't remember. So just for now.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I think the repetition of the text is definitely a very curious phenomena that if not being the content of the text is so clear, that I would almost think that this could have been the kind of exercise of composing texts, or even because we do have in the bureaucratic, the actual official context, you have people practicing composing, but more importantly, copying, learning how to write. But this one, I think at this time, I wouldn't go in that direction. But and also the difference. So the two texts they do overlap, but also not entirely. For instance, the back one does have a section that is lacking from the previous one. So I can only speculate that maybe the idea was just by adding on, by repeatedly having these texts, that the content may not be the most important thing, but their presence in written. That may be, and this is something I don't have time to go into, but the power of the writing, the writing itself as a kind of empowerment, and having the ritual function to ward off evil influences. So that would be I think among the various interpretations we can entertain, that may be one I would inclined to go with. That this is an indication that by this time, writing originally early on was new technology, was a privilege, was prerogative of the high elite. So if we look at oracle bones, we look at bronzes, they were not meant to, the writing, this action itself and the mere presence of writing already embodies power. And by this time, by the early imperial, and then this was 4th century already, writing was almost a common technology yes, not everybody in the society can write, but a very large number due to the large bureaucracy and the training of the scribal training. So here we really see kind of the shifting of power or the perceived power from writing itself as a new technology and privilege to the format. For instance, this is the format modeled upon the bureaucratic official documents. And so this kind of close modeling could also be seen as an effort to draw power through the powerful bureaucracy that ruled the living and clearly also believed to rule the dead. So that's a kind of a long answer to that. And in terms of whether or not such kind of objects and the practices associated with that belong to or can be identified precisely with certain religious traditions, many of the reason I am going towards this composite and hybrid direction is also because actually most of these elements that we have seen on this one object, we have earlier precedents, earlier kind of texts without image or simply figurines like without texts, but they appear in the same context in tombs. So, so if I go through a few things that I prepared, things like this kind of very crudely made figurine, but accompanied with texts, such texts like this, which is a different kind of text. It's a transfer documents that in the early empires that living people, if you need to relocate, you actually need to apply a permit, almost like a passport, a pass. And that kind of practice being utilized for the deceased as well. So when the deceased moved from the living to the underworld, that in this case, this old lady was also prepared of such a pass and to permit her to relocate, to move, but more importantly, to guarantee whatever she brings with her, in this case would be the buried grave goods, her properties, her servants, and also some of her prerogative privileges, like being exempted from paying tax and quarry labors, would also be properly recognized in the underworld by registering with the underworld bureaucracy using these documents. So all of these, and another one which is an Eastern Han, 2nd century CE, that we see finally that the image, objects, and texts goes together, but different from the object that I've shown to you today. But this one, again, this one actually was found among official documents in a well. So this probably doesn't, they originally were not meant for a burial mortuary usage, but for the, it could be just the officials having certain needs and then they having such kind of ritualistic or talisman made. I said all of these is to answer the question, of course, that when the institutionalized, such as the Celestial Masters, appeared, that they very quickly adopted many of the elements, the format. But all of these also had earlier origins that we can actually track through this module or this composite model. And thus, I would say, I think always to try to correlate such kind of objects and practices with identifiable religion, that might not be the most fruitful route to go.
you think you could show the image of the object? I'm wondering, I'm looking at it, and in some ways I'm reminded a little bit of bronzes with inscriptions, where you have an object that, in the case of bronzes, it's created through one process, and then afterwards, it's inscribed on. And for this object, I'm also wondering how the different stages of production can kind of be teased out, right? Like, is this the kind of thing where someone who's good at carving and drawing will get in there first and carve out and draw the object, and then afterwards, whoever's the expert, the writing expert, or whoever's maybe just practicing writing, will get in there afterwards and just fill in whatever space is left over? Or was this whole image, or this whole object, previously envisioned before the whole process started, that there's going to be an image here, and then the writing is going to take up this space? I'm wondering, what do you think?
I think I can kind of answer that question from two perspectives. One is just to look at this object, because none of the writings actually overlap with the image. So that seems to be, and the image itself is a low relief. So, so I would think that probably involved a certain kind of pre-design. And if I have to speculate, I would think the image came first. They have this, as you see from the side view, they have this rather thick board, and then they carved out the pine man, and then the writings probably comes after, but whether or not they were coming from the same hand, I cannot tell. The back and forth, it seems, I mean, both are quite sloppy writing. So I probably would say that the writings might be done by the same person, but the image, then there's no way to tell. But another perspective, which I have to again use much later and still unpublished object that just recently a friend of mine showed me, and this is from the possibly I think 800 or maybe 900. So it's actually post-Tang. And we see a figurine. It's actually a three-dimensional figurine. And those figurines you see very often in the later post-Han tombs, 6th Dynasty tombs, and this one was made of wood, even though most of those figurines generally would be made of the ceramic pottery ones. And this one, the figurine is extremely well made, very refined of facial. And then we see very similar, but all the writings were on the figurine itself. So on the robe and at the back. And that I see it as as I was discussing with my friend who showed me this object, I was saying this almost made me think it could be just somebody bought this mass-produced but very well-made figurine and added the writing on that. So again, this is really seems to suggest these ritual knowledge and practices and technologies, whether it is making figurines or being able to produce such kind of writings, where it was a repertoire that people can quite freely draw from. And that would be a case. I see it more clearly because of the writing, again, quite sloppy, but the figurine itself is extremely exquisite.
Well, just I'm following on from that. I wondered whether, and I think you already brought this up with the Mawangdui piece with Henry Theok, and I was wondering, whether part of the hybrid, the composite, especially with this sort of intertextuality that was going on with the Pine Man and the Cypress Man, did, in some sense, or if it's fruitful to think about it in relationship to the inventory list, which is for which that's a sort of preface that includes lists of these particular and these tomb figurines themselves. So there is this sense that they're not just objects, but as you pointed out, there are these other objects that are also hybrid, but they depend on each other. So they're not just hybrid composite objects; they're part of a set. And I wonder whether the tomb inventory, the choice of a particular set and framing of that in relationship to the experience of the underworld, and this particular choice of these objects, is one way of thinking about these hybrid objects as not only on their own, but as sort of compression almost. I mean, you're talking about the object, and then there's stuff right in there.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that for a minute.
Absolutely. I think this is where I intended it actually to include, but I know since I've put in so much writing or text in it, so I didn't include the tomb inventory that Tamara was referring to, which we can actually trace it back to Mawangdui, was of course an extremely extensive example of that, like in these so in these large tombs, when they have thousands of items buried, they actually made a tomb inventory that probably functions as a checklist before the burial, and then they also include those inventories in the burial itself. So this is really, I don't think they did that for us, but we did benefit from having such texts. And we can trace back to the Warren States of some of the true tombs that also mentioning, in particularly in the tomb inventory, where we find these figurines that they don't have any writings on themselves. But then in the inventory, they would talk about these they would call the Wang Tong or Ming Tong, or you could say spirit child, spirit servants. So you are absolutely right, and this is something what I'm trying to do is to kind of tease out the different sources that such kind of composite will eventually become possible and then became popular as we see later on. But what you pointed out too is to really looking at them each of the particular object themselves in their own set. That is another route that I certainly see for certain cases, such as rich of a burial as the Mawangdui, that should be the direction we are going. So instead of studying the inventory by themselves, mostly by textual historians, and then the tomb very well made, not this one, but there were hundreds of well-made tomb figurines by the art historians that they need to be looked at it as one set, because indeed they exist as a site, and their existence and their presence were interdependent. So I don't know if we do see intertextuality here. Do we see into objectivity, but referring to the object, the artifacts? Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for just one last question. A small question is fine if there's no other.
I just wondered if you know what kind of wood it is, since they're mentioning Cypress Man and Pine Man and there's various iterations, if the material itself could be additional.
This is like our armchair archaeology, like I would like to call myself, that have the disadvantage of, no, I don't know, and I wish they do the test. So this one actually specifically asked the museum like whether they tested what kind of wood that was. Unfortunately, no, they didn't. And the one I just mentioned, which, because I forgot to mention the important part, that one is self-identified as the Cypress Man. So that was, and then interestingly, many of the later examples that they were many of them were the cypress. And I just wanted to, even though I do not know whether or not the actual material match their self-reference in terms of their material, which sometimes I would think maybe not, because the reason that pine or cypress or peach, these materials and these particular trees and woods were believed in, and we know we have texts to say that they themselves having these epitropic qualities. So we see them repeatedly throughout, regardless, I think, whether or not they were actually made of pine wood or cypress wood or even peach wood.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.